German Shepherd saves toddler from traffic. What she did next will melt your heart. A little girl. A silent scream. A moment that shattered the silence of an entire town. What she did next left doctors stunned and strangers in tears. This is more than a rescue. It's a lesson in bravery, love, and what it truly means to be human. Like, share, and tell us where you're watching from, because this story will stay with you long after it ends. It was late afternoon, the kind of hour when sunlight drapes every house in a warm, golden glow and the air smells faintly of freshly cut grass. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a child's laughter floated lazily through the breeze. Everything looked and felt safe, exactly the sort of day when nothing terrible could possibly happen. Bella, a magnificent German Shepherd, was stretched out in the far corner of her yard. Her eyes were half closed, but her ears were always listening. She was the quiet guardian of Maplewood Avenue, the sort of dog who noticed things long before anyone else did. That day, she was simply watching the slow dance of clouds in the sky until a sound broke the rhythm. It was the soft, innocent giggle of a little boy. Bella's head lifted. Across the street, Ethan, barely 3 years old, was toddling along the edge of his driveway. His mother must have stepped inside, perhaps only for a moment. But sometimes, a single moment is all it takes for everything to change. Bella's gaze locked on him as he shuffled closer to the curb. In the distance, the low rumble of an engine began to swell. The breeze shifted, carrying with it the sharp, hot scent of rubber on asphalt. A delivery truck came into view at the far end of the road, moving at just the wrong speed, fast enough to be dangerous, slow enough to make you think it was safe. And then Ethan stepped into the street. Time seemed to slow. The truck's chrome grille caught the fading light, sending a brief flash across the quiet houses. Somewhere, a horn blared, a desperate, drawn-out warning. Ethan froze, his little arms hanging at his sides, his eyes wide as if he'd wandered into another world. Bella didn't hesitate. In a single explosive leap, she cleared the low wooden fence, hitting the pavement with a thud that echoed in the still air. Her claws scraped against the road as she sprinted, her body a blur of black and tan. Every stride closed the impossible distance between her and the boy. The driver's eyes went wide. Tires screamed, filling the air with the acrid smell of burning rubber. A neighbor gasped somewhere nearby, the sound sharp and brittle. Bella reached Ethan and swung her body in front of him, lowering her shoulder just enough to push him toward the opposite curb. The boy stumbled, fell to his knees, and tumbled onto the grass, out of the truck's path. The truck came to a shuddering stop, its front bumper barely crossing the spot where Ethan had been standing seconds earlier. The driver's hands trembled on the steering wheel, his face pale. Slowly, he climbed down, as though moving too quickly might shatter the fragile reality that Ethan was still alive. The little boy sat stunned on the grass, his lower lip trembling. Bella turned to him, pressing her nose gently to his cheek, her eyes scanning him as if to ask, "Are you hurt?" His small hands reached up, clutching the thick fur around her neck. His breathing was uneven, shaky, but steadying as he buried his face against her. Across the street, the world began moving again. Footsteps pounded on concrete as Ethan's mother came running, her voice breaking as she called his name. Margaret, Bella's elderly owner, stood frozen at the fence, one hand gripping the wooden post, the other pressed to her chest as her heart thundered in her ears. The driver stammered apologies, but no one was listening to him. Every eye was on Bella, standing solid and unshaken, her body still angled protectively in front of the boy. The breeze lifted the fur along her neck, but she didn't move until Ethan was safely in his mother's arms. Neighbors began whispering to each other, voices low with disbelief. Some spoke of instinct, others of training, still others of sheer luck. But those who had known Bella for years shared something different in their tone. an unspoken certainty. Because as remarkable as this was, it wasn't the first time Bella had acted like a hero. And what she did after saving the child left everyone utterly speechless. Margaret Whitfield had lived on Maplewood Avenue for more than 3 decades, and her little white house with the blue shutters had become as much a part of the street as the old oak tree that shaded it. Retirement had given her time for the simple pleasures she loved, caring for the garden her late husband had once planted, chatting over fences with neighbors, and enjoying the slow rhythm of a quiet afternoon. On that particular day, the sun was gentle, wrapping the street in a warm glow, the air carrying the sweet scent of lavender and freshly cut grass. In the corner of the yard lay Bella, Margaret's constant companion. The German shepherd's coat gleamed in the sunlight, a perfect blend of black and gold, her sharp ears turning at the slightest sound. She wasn't just a pet, she was a sentinel, quietly watching over her world. Sometimes Margaret wondered if Bella was more aware of the street's heartbeat than any of its people. She noticed things before they happened, responded to sounds no one else heard, and carried herself with the calm certainty of one who knew her purpose. Across the way, Mrs. Henderson tended to her petunias while Mr. Bailey, the retired postman, lounged on his porch with a crossword puzzle and a sweating glass of lemonade. Conversations drifted between houses, the kind of easy chatter that came from years of familiarity. The street was a small community, the kind where people waved to passing cars and knew each other's birthdays without writing them down. And among the regular fixtures of the neighborhood's afternoons was Ethan. Barely 3 years old, with a mop of blonde curls and cheeks that flushed with excitement at the smallest things, Ethan had a habit of wandering to the edge of his yard each day just to wave at Bella. Sometimes he held a toy car in his hand, sometimes a cookie, but his grin was always the same, pure, uncomplicated joy. Margaret often caught herself smiling at the sight of him. Bella, for her part, seemed to recognize him as someone worth noticing. Her tail would wag slowly when he appeared, her head tilting ever so slightly as if she were listening to a voice only the two of them could hear. Ethan's mother, Claire, was never far behind, usually watching from the porch or kneeling in her own garden. She was friendly but carried a quiet tiredness that Margaret understood. Claire's husband was away most of the time, deployed overseas, and she was learning, as so many had before her, how to manage a household alone. But on this day, nothing about her manners suggested worry. The street felt safe. Life felt steady. Margaret had been kneeling among her roses, carefully snipping away the faded blooms. She straightened now and then to stretch her back, taking in the gentle murmur of the neighborhood. Somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower buzzed. The screen door of a house creaked open and closed. Bella rose to her feet briefly, pacing the fence line before settling back into the grass, her eyes never leaving the street. Ethan was at his usual spot, waving enthusiastically. Margaret returned the gesture, chuckling under her breath as Bella's ears perked at the sight of him. The boy took a few steps forward, stopping just at the edge of his driveway, his little sneakers planted firmly in the gravel. Claire called something from the porch, her voice warm and light. It was one of those snapshots in time you never think to remember. The smell of the air, the way the sun slanted across the road, the comfortable hum of a neighborhood at peace. If there was a shadow creeping toward them, it was hidden well. Nothing in that moment hinted at the way the world would tilt in the minutes to come. For now, it was just another quiet afternoon on Maplewood Avenue, the kind where you believed, without question, that nothing could go wrong. It happened so quickly that Margaret almost didn't register the first sign. She was bent over her lavender bed, the faint hum of bees in her ears, when Bella let out a single bark, short, sharp, and unlike her usual greeting call. Margaret froze. Bella didn't bark like that without a reason. When she looked up, Bella was already on her feet, her body tense in a way that set every instinct in Margaret's chest on edge. The shepherd's tail had gone rigid, her ears pricked forward, eyes locked on something across the street. Margaret followed her gaze and saw Ethan. The little boy had wandered farther than usual, his sneakers scuffing across the end of his driveway. He was already at the curb, peering with innocent curiosity at something beyond, his attention fixed on the far side of the road. Claire wasn't in sight. Maybe she'd stepped inside for a moment, maybe to grab him a snack. But whatever the reason, Ethan was alone. Margaret started to call out, but the sound caught in her throat. Somewhere in the distance came a low, steady rumble. It was faint at first, like a storm still miles away, but growing louder with each passing second. She turned her head toward the bend in the road and saw it. A delivery truck, not barreling but moving fast enough to make her stomach tighten. It was close enough now for the sun to glint off its windshield. Bella's posture shifted, and for a heartbeat, Margaret thought she saw the world through the dog's eyes. The distance between Ethan and the truck was closing. There was no time to wait for a shout to be heard, no chance for the driver to stop before he reached the boy. The air seemed to grow heavy, sounds dulling until all Margaret could hear was the thud of her own heartbeat in her ears. Bella moved like a released arrow. She surged forward, her paws hitting the grass in a rapid rhythm, then the hollow slap of claws on pavement. Margaret's breath caught. It was all happening too fast. The driver must have seen the boy now. His brake lights flared red, the high-pitched scream of tires tearing against asphalt filled the street. The scent of hot rubber stung Margaret's nose, mingling with the sharp tang of fear. Ethan's head turned at the noise, his small body frozen in confusion. He didn't run, didn't cry. He just stood there, staring at the looming shape of the truck that seemed to swell larger with every blink. Bella reached him in seconds. She didn't slow. She angled her body just enough to shield him from the front, lowering her shoulder and pressing against his side. The push wasn't rough, but it was firm enough to topple him backward, sending him sprawling onto the grassy strip between the curb and the sidewalk. He landed with a soft grunt, the air puffing from his lungs. The truck came to a shuddering stop, its front bumper crossing the space where Ethan had been standing only moments ago. The engine idled loudly, a harsh counterpoint to the sudden silence that had fallen over the neighborhood. The driver's face was pale, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. Slowly, he shoved the gear into park and climbed down, his legs unsteady. Margaret was already moving, her hat slipping from her head as she ran across the street. Ethan's mother came from the opposite direction, her voice breaking into a desperate cry as she called his name. The boy sat where he'd fallen, eyes wide, breathing quick and shallow. Bella stood in front of him, her frame steady, tail lowered, gaze fixed on the truck like she wasn't convinced the danger was over. Margaret dropped to her knees beside him, her hands trembling as she reached out. Oh, sweetheart. She ran her fingers over his arms and legs, looking for any sign of injury. He blinked at her, his lower lip trembling, and then his attention turned to Bella. The small hands that had been lying limp at his sides reached up to clutch at the thick fur of her neck. He pressed his face into her shoulder, his little body shuddering. The driver was stammering apologies, his words tumbling over each other in uneven bursts, but neither Margaret nor Claire were listening. Claire was already crouched, wrapping Ethan into her arms, her own breath hitching in relief. "Oh my God, thank you," she whispered to Bella, though her voice shook too much to make the words steady. Neighbors were gathering now, Mrs. Henderson still holding her watering can, Mr. Bailey with his crossword folded under one arm. Their expressions were all the same: shock, relief, and something like awe. They looked at Bella as if seeing her for the first time, not just as the quiet dog who lounged behind the fence each afternoon, but as something far greater. Bella finally shifted her gaze from the truck to Ethan, giving him one slow, deliberate lick across the cheek before stepping back. She seemed to relax only when Margaret rested a hand on her side, murmuring her name in a voice thick with emotion. The moment stretched, each second etched into the memories of everyone who had seen it. Later, they would replay it over and over. The bark, the dash, the impact avoided by mere feet. Some would call it instinct, others training, still others luck. But for those who knew Bella, there was a different certainty in their voices. This wasn't the first time she had been exactly where she needed to be at exactly the right moment. And as Margaret looked at her now, standing quietly beside Ethan, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wouldn't be the last time either. In the hours after the rescue, Maplewood Avenue buzzed with the kind of quiet excitement that comes when an ordinary day suddenly turns extraordinary. People lingered on their porches, conversations hushed but animated, as though speaking too loudly might break the spell of what they'd just witnessed. The story traveled faster than any newspaper headline could, neighbors retelling it in vivid detail, each adding their own touch of wonder to the moment Bella had leapt the fence and saved Ethan's life. By evening, Claire's phone was full of messages from people up and down the street. "That dog is amazing. She's a hero. How did she know?" There was something about the way Bella had moved, not just fast, but with certainty, as if she hadn't been reacting so much as anticipating. She hadn't looked confused or startled. She'd simply thrown. Margaret sat at her kitchen table that night, a cup of tea cooling in her hands, replaying the scene in her mind. The sharp bark, the leap, the push that sent Ethan sprawling into safety. She'd always known Bella was a smart dog, but there was a precision in her actions that went beyond instinct. It was as though Bella had read the future in those few seconds and chosen the only path that could save him. And it wasn't the first time. Margaret thought back to a winter evening 2 years earlier. She'd been in the kitchen, roasting chicken, when Bella had appeared in the doorway, ears pricked, eyes fixed on her. There'd been no sound, no smell of smoke yet, but Bella had barked once, low and insistent, then trotted toward the hallway. Margaret followed her, puzzled, until Bella stopped at the laundry room door. That was when Margaret saw it, a faint wisp of smoke curling from the corner of the dryer. One of the wires had shorted, already burning through the insulation. If Bella hadn't alerted her, the whole house might have gone up before she even realized what was happening. Then there was the spring after Margaret's husband passed away. Grief had settled over the street in small, heavy ways, especially for Mrs. Rivera, who lived 2 doors down. She had lost her own husband just months before, and most days she sat on her porch in silence, staring out at nothing in particular. One afternoon, Margaret had gone over to check on her, only to find Bella already sitting beside the older woman's chair, her large head resting gently in Mrs. Rivera's lap. No one had told Bella to go there. She'd slipped out of the gate when Margaret was busy in the garden and found her way to Mrs. Rivera on her own. Margaret would later hear from Mrs. Rivera that Bella had stayed with her for hours that day, not moving except to press closer whenever the woman's shoulders shook. And then, of course, there was the lake incident. That summer, a neighborhood picnic had been set up near the small man-made lake in the park at the edge of town. Children ran everywhere, chasing balls and blowing bubbles. At some point, a little boy, no more than 5, wandered away from the group, chasing a paper boat that had drifted toward the water's edge. Margaret had been mid-conversation when Bella's ears shot up. Without a sound, she bolted toward the shoreline. By the time Margaret and the others reached her, Bella was standing between the boy and the steep drop-off into the water, her body angled to block his path. The boy's shoes were wet from the lapping waves, and he looked up at Bella in surprise, as if she'd appeared out of thin air. His parents rushed in seconds later, pale-faced and breathless. It was these moments, scattered across the years, that began to stitch together into something larger in the minds of those who knew her. She wasn't just a loyal companion. She was watchful, intentional, almost knowing. The whispers started soon after the rescue. "She has a sixth sense," someone said at the market. "That dog's part angel," muttered Mr. Bailey on his porch. Margaret would hear these comments and feel a tug of agreement, even if she couldn't explain it herself. That night, as Bella lay at the foot of her bed, Margaret found herself studying her in the dim light. "How did you know?" she asked quietly, as if Bella might actually answer. Bella only lifted her head for a moment, meeting Margaret's gaze with those deep, steady eyes, before resting it back down with a sigh. Margaret sipped her now cold tea, the day replaying over and over. She thought of Ethan's little hands clutching Bella's fur, of the calm way Bella had stood even as the truck screeched to a halt. It wasn't the frantic, barking chaos of a startled animal. It was the deliberate, purposeful action of someone who understood exactly what needed to be done. And as she sat there in the stillness of her kitchen, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that Bella's role in their lives was bigger than anyone had realized. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was training. But maybe, just maybe, it was something more. Something you couldn't quite name but knew, deep down, was real. In the minutes after the truck finally pulled away, the neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. People were still standing in their yards, leaning over fences, clutching watering cans or dish towels they'd carried outside without thinking. The drama had passed, but its weight lingered in the air. And in the center of it all was Bella, still standing guard over Ethan, her shadow stretched across the grass where he sat. Even when Claire dropped to her knees and gathered her son into her arms, Bella didn't move. She stayed close enough that her fur brushed against Ethan's small shoulder. The boy clung to her, his face buried deep in the thick ruff of her neck, his sobs muffled against her. Every time Claire tried to pull him fully into her lap, Ethan would twist back toward Bella, his tiny hands gripping fistfuls of fur. "It's okay, baby," Claire murmured, but her voice cracked. She looked up at Margaret with eyes wide and glistening. "She saved him." The words seemed too small for what had happened. Margaret could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. The driver had long since apologized and driven away, still pale and shaken. Neighbors drifted back toward their homes, though a few lingered, watching with something like reverence as Bella lowered herself onto the grass beside Ethan. She lay down slowly, curling her body in a half-circle around him. He reached out, pressing one tiny palm against her chest, feeling the steady thump of her heartbeat beneath the fur. Gradually, his own breathing began to match hers. Margaret stayed until Claire finally managed to coax Ethan toward their front porch. But even then, Bella followed. She padded up the walkway behind them, pausing only when she reached the steps. Claire glanced back, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her mouth despite the tears still on her cheeks. "Come on," she said softly, holding the door open. From that moment on, something unspoken passed between Bella and Ethan. The next morning, Margaret found her standing by the gate, ears perked toward the street. She let Bella out, expecting her to wander the yard, but instead the shepherd trotted straight across to Claire's house. She sat patiently on the porch until the door opened and Ethan came toddling out in his pajamas, a sippy cup in one hand. After that, it became routine. Bella would visit daily, sometimes in the morning, sometimes in the late afternoon. She never bounded in with wild energy. She seemed to know exactly how to approach him. She'd lower her head to his level, letting him wrap his arms around her neck or bury his face in her fur. They played in the yard, Ethan giggling as Bella nosed a small ball toward him, always gentle enough that it rolled slowly to his feet. Margaret learned more about the family in those days. Claire had moved to Maplewood Avenue only 6 months earlier, following her husband's deployment overseas. With no family nearby and a toddler to care for, she'd been doing her best to settle in, but the adjustment had been harder than she let on. The rescue had shaken her deeply, but it had also, strangely, eased something in her, knowing that someone, even a dog, seemed to be watching over her son. On warm afternoons, Margaret would see them through her kitchen window, Ethan sitting in the grass, his head resting against Bella's side, the dog stretched out beside him like a living pillow. Sometimes Claire would bring a blanket onto the porch, and Bella would lie down with Ethan nestled against her, both of them drifting into naps in the gentle shade. Bella never stirred until Ethan woke. There were small moments too, the kind that didn't make a story but still spoke volumes. Like the time Ethan tripped over the garden hose, skinning his knee. Before Claire could even reach him, Bella was there, pressing her nose gently to his cheek, standing close until the tears slowed. Or the rainy afternoon when Ethan sat by the window, watching puddles form in the driveway. Bella sat beside him the whole time, their reflections side by side in the glass. For Margaret, it was impossible not to notice the change in Ethan. He still had his toddler bursts of energy, but he was calmer now, more confident when Bella was nearby. She had seen children form bonds with animals before, but this was different. There was a steadiness to the way they were with each other, as if they shared some private understanding born from that moment in the street. And for Bella, it was as though her days had a new rhythm, one that revolved around making sure Ethan was safe and content. She still kept her post by Margaret's fence, still surveyed the street with her usual quiet vigilance, but her attention seemed drawn more often to the small house across the way. As weeks passed, neighbors noticed too. "That boy's got himself a guardian angel," Mrs. Henderson said one morning as she passed by. Mr. Bailey called out from his porch, "You should put her on the payroll, Margaret." They meant it lightly, but the sentiment carried truth. Bella had taken it upon herself to be more than a neighbor's dog. She was Ethan's protector, his comfort, his friend. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the street began to settle into the hush of twilight, Margaret stood on her porch watching Bella walk slowly back from Claire's house. Ethan stood on the steps, waving until Bella reached the gate. She slipped inside, gave Margaret a brief glance as if to say, "All's well," and settled down with a sigh. Margaret smiled, her heart full in a way she couldn't quite explain. She knew Bella's instincts had saved Ethan's life that day, but what had followed, these quiet visits, the steady companionship, felt just as important. Maybe more so. This wasn't just protection. It was love in its purest form, steady and uncomplicated, the kind that asked for nothing in return. The weeks that followed the rescue unfolded in a kind of gentle rhythm. Bella still made her daily visits to Ethan, padding across the street with the unhurried gait of someone who knew they were expected. The bond between them deepened, woven through with afternoons spent in the yard, quiet naps in the shade, and the occasional toddler giggle that floated all the way back to Margaret's kitchen window. Life on Maplewood Avenue settled into something that felt steady again, safe, familiar, until the day Bella changed. It was a mild Wednesday morning, the sort of day where the air was warm but the sun still felt soft. Margaret had let Bella out as usual, expecting her to head straight for Claire's porch. But when Bella reached the bottom of the steps where Ethan sat playing with a toy truck, she didn't flop down beside him like she normally did. Instead, she froze. Her head came up sharply, ears pricked, eyes narrowing toward the far end of the street. Margaret followed her gaze but saw nothing unusual, just a pale van, moving slowly past the houses. It wasn't the delivery truck they were used to. This one was older, paint dulled, a dent in the side panel. The windows were tinted too dark to see inside. Bella's body stiffened. Her tail went low and still, her shoulders tight. Margaret had seen that posture before, alert, assessing, not yet aggressive but ready if she had to be. The van crawled past, turned the corner at the end of the block, and disappeared. Only then did Bella relax enough to sit beside Ethan, though her eyes kept flicking toward the bend in the road as if expecting it to return. "Probably nothing," Margaret muttered to herself, but the words didn't sit comfortably. Somewhere in the back of her mind, an old memory stirred. Years ago, long before Bella, there had been a string of petty thefts in the neighborhood, packages gone from porches, garden tools missing from sheds. The one detail everyone remembered was a similar vehicle seen idling too long on quiet streets. The next few days passed without incident, but Bella was different. She seemed to hear things no one else noticed: a door shutting 3 houses down, the faint rumble of an engine approaching before it even turned onto their street. Sometimes she would interrupt her games with Ethan to pace the edge of the yard, her eyes scanning the road, nose lifting as though testing the air. On Friday afternoon, Margaret was sitting with Claire on her porch while Ethan and Bella played nearby. The conversation was easy: grocery prices, the stubborn squirrel that kept raiding Margaret's bird feeder, until Bella stopped mid-step, her ears swiveling toward the sound of a vehicle somewhere beyond the houses. She moved to the front gate, standing rigid, and a low growl rumbled in her chest. Margaret glanced up just in time to see the same pale van pass by again. This time it didn't slow quite as much, but the timing was odd. Mid-afternoon on a weekday, no delivery scheduled for anyone on the block. Claire's eyes met Margaret's, and neither of them spoke for a moment. After that, Bella became almost relentless in her watchfulness. If Ethan was outside, she was always positioned between him and the street. She would follow him closely as he toddled around the yard, ears constantly twitching, muscles tight. If a car slowed even slightly near the curb, her body shifted forward, weight balanced and ready. One evening, when the sun had nearly slipped behind the rooftops, Margaret called Bella in for supper. But Bella stood rooted in place, eyes locked down the street. Margaret shaded her eyes and saw the van again, further away this time, creeping along as though whoever was inside was in no hurry to be anywhere. Something in Margaret's stomach nodded. It wasn't the first time she trusted Bella's instincts, and she knew better than to dismiss them now. The rest of the night, she couldn't shake the image of the van. She remembered the strange unease years ago, the way people had brushed off the earlier incidents until something finally happened. And now, seeing Bella's change in behavior, she felt the edges of that same dread creeping in. In the days that followed, Bella's vigilance grew even sharper. She refused to let Ethan wander near the edge of the driveway without positioning herself as a barrier. If she heard an unfamiliar sound, a metallic clank, a quick burst of footsteps on the sidewalk, she'd leave whatever she was doing to investigate. More than once, Margaret caught her standing at the fence long after dark, nose in the wind, tail stiff. It was subtle enough that an outsider might not notice, but for Margaret and Claire, it was impossible to miss. Something in the air had shifted, and Bella had sensed it before either of them could put a name to it. What Margaret didn't yet realize was that the next time the van appeared, it wouldn't just pass by. The afternoon was quiet in the way summer days sometimes are, the air warm but heavy, the neighborhood wrapped in a lazy stillness. Claire was on the porch, her phone pressed to her ear, trying to sort out a late bill with a customer service representative who seemed determined to keep her on hold forever. Ethan was in the front yard with his little plastic dump truck, pushing it back and forth along the edge of the driveway while humming to himself. Bella lay nearby, her head resting between her paws, watching him in that steady, unblinking way she always did. From Margaret's window across the street, it was an ordinary scene, ordinary enough to make what happened next feel like a sudden tear in the fabric of the day. She was washing dishes when she noticed Bella's ears flick forward, her head lifting sharply. A low sound rose from her throat, not quite a growl, but a warning. Margaret followed her gaze, and there it was, the pale van. This time, it didn't crawl by at a slow, uncertain pace. It rolled to a stop right in front of Claire's house. The driver's window was down halfway, but the angle made it impossible to see more than the shadow of a figure inside. Bella was on her feet instantly, her entire body transforming from stillness into coiled power. The fur along her neck rose like a bristled mane, and she surged forward, planting herself between Ethan and the street. The suddenness of her movement startled Ethan, But before he could even react, Bella's bark shattered the quiet. It wasn't her normal deep, stay-away bark. This was something rawer, louder, each sharp report echoing off the houses like a siren. The driver hesitated for a split second. Margaret saw it, saw the way the shadow in the van shifted, as if calculating whether to stay or go. Bella took a step forward, bark after bark, her teeth flashing as she let out a deep, guttural growl that carried a promise. "Come closer, and you'll regret it." The sound brought movement to the street. Mrs. Henderson dropped her watering can and stepped out to the sidewalk. Mr. Bailey pushed himself out of his porch chair, his voice calling out, "Everything all right?" A curtain twitched in the house next door. The driver's decision came quickly after that. The van lurched forward, tires squealing as it sped down the street, disappearing around the same bend it always came from. Bella didn't move until the sound of the engine had faded completely. Only then did she glance back at Ethan, checking him with the same focused attention she'd given him the day of the rescue in the street. Claire had dropped her phone on the porch, sprinting down the steps. She scooped Ethan into her arms, holding him so tightly he squirmed. Her voice trembled as she murmured, "Oh my God, oh my God." She crouched to meet Bella's gaze, one hand still clutching Ethan, the other burying itself in Bella's fur. "You knew." Margaret was already crossing the street, her heart pounding. The tension in her chest loosened only when she reached them, resting a shaking hand on Bella's back. "I saw it stop," she said, her voice low. "That wasn't right." Within an hour, a police car idled at the curb. The officer, a tall man with sunburned cheeks, listened as Claire and Margaret described the van. The dent in the side panel, the tinted windows, the way it had lingered on the street before speeding off. When they finished, he nodded grimly. "We've had reports about a vehicle matching that description," he said. "There've been 2 attempted child abductions in a town 15 miles from here. Sounds like the same van." The words settled over them like a sudden drop in temperature. Claire's arms tightened around Ethan until he gave a small grunt. She eased her hold just enough to let him breathe, her eyes shining with tears that threatened to spill over. Margaret's own vision blurred as she looked down at Bella, who was sitting calmly now, as if she hadn't just stood between a child and danger. Claire knelt in front of her again, Ethan still in her lap. "You saved him again," she whispered, her voice breaking on the last word. Bella tilted her head, those steady brown eyes locking onto Claire's, then flicking to Ethan, as if to remind them that protecting him wasn't an act of heroism, it was simply what she did. Margaret stood there in the late afternoon light, one hand covering her mouth, feeling the weight of what could have happened settle heavy in her chest. She reached down, threading her fingers gently through Bella's thick fur, and whispered, "Good girl." Her voice cracked on the words. Around them, neighbors lingered, their conversations hushed. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others kept glancing up the street as though expecting the van to reappear. But in the center of it all, Bella remained still, her body a steady anchor for the boy who refused to let go of her. And as the police car finally pulled away, leaving the street quiet again, there was no doubt in anyone's mind. Bella wasn't just the neighborhood's dog. She was its guardian. Word of Bella's second act of heroism spread through Maplewood Avenue faster than the mail truck. By the next morning, everyone knew, and by the end of the week, people from outside the neighborhood were stopping by just to catch a glimpse of the hero dog. Claire, overwhelmed but deeply moved, decided to open her front gate to visitors who came bearing treats and thanks. Bella accepted them all politely, her tail wagging in slow, steady sweeps, though she seemed more interested in keeping one eye on Ethan than in the plates of biscuits and bones being offered to her. A few days later, the neighbors organized something special. It wasn't formal, just a gathering in front of Margaret's house, where the wide patch of lawn could hold a few folding chairs and the long folding table Mrs. Henderson dragged from her garage. There were pitchers of lemonade, plates of cookies, a tray of little sandwiches that Mr. Bailey's daughter had made, and the faint strains of old swing music playing from someone's portable speaker. Children from the block had drawn pictures of Bella, some with crayon-scribbled hearts, others showing her standing in front of Ethan like a knight guarding a castle. Claire hung them from a string between two porch posts, where they fluttered in the breeze. When the time came to speak, Margaret stepped forward. She wasn't one for speeches, but her voice carried the kind of sincerity that didn't need polish. "Bella has always been my companion," she began, glancing down at the shepherd sitting calmly beside her. "But she's also been something more, something I can't quite explain. Twice now, she's put herself between danger and someone she loves. Twice, she's made sure a family stayed whole. I don't think you can measure that kind of loyalty. You can only be grateful for it." Claire followed, her voice trembling as she thanked the neighbors for their kindness and the police for their quick response. "But most of all, Bella. I sleep easier," she admitted, knowing she's watching over Ethan. "She's not just a dog to us anymore, she's family." Ethan, in her arms, nodded as if he understood every word, his small hand tangled in Bella's fur. Someone took a photo then. Margaret, Claire, Ethan, and Bella together. That image would make its way into the next edition of the Maplewood Gazette under the headline, "German Shepherd Saves Toddler Twice." The article detailed both rescues, weaving in neighbors' quotes and painting Bella as a living legend on their quiet street. In the days that followed, life began to return to its gentle pace. The van never came back, whether because of the police attention or because Bella's fierce bark had done its work, no one knew. Ethan still played in the yard, but always with Bella nearby. Sometimes she lay in the grass, pretending to doze, but her ears would twitch at every sound. Sometimes she followed him as he toddled from the porch to the flower beds, her nose brushing his shoulder as if counting each step. Margaret found herself watching these moments more closely than ever before. She thought about all the years Bella had been by her side, the quiet ways she'd protected without ever needing to be asked. The more she reflected, the more she realized that Bella's loyalty wasn't just about instinct, it was about love. Love that wasn't loud or demanding, but steady and ever-present, the kind you could lean on without even realizing you were doing it. And in that reflection, Margaret saw something deeper. Bella's story wasn't just about one dog and one boy. It was about the fabric of their little community, about how they looked out for each other. If Bella had been watching that day in the street, so had Margaret. If the van's return had set Bella on edge, it had made the neighbors more watchful too. The truth was, they all carried a piece of that guardianship, each in their own way. The seniors on the block often talked about how things used to be, when you knew everyone's names, when a knock on the door was more likely to bring a pie than a sales pitch. Watching Bella with Ethan, Margaret realized those days weren't gone at all. They were still here, living in every small act of care, in every pair of eyes that noticed when something was out of place, in every unspoken promise to step in when someone needed help. For the older folks who gathered on porches and leaned over fences, Bella's story became more than just a tale to tell over coffee. It was a reminder that age didn't lessen the need for vigilance or the capacity for connection. It was a story about being part of something bigger than yourself, whether you were a dog, a child, or a retiree tending roses. As summer edged into fall, Margaret often found herself standing at the fence in the early evenings, watching the sun spill gold over the street. Bella would be at her side or across the way with Ethan, and Margaret's heart would settle into a calm she couldn't quite name. On the last evening of August, as the air cooled and the first stars appeared, Margaret sat on her porch with Bella at her feet. She could hear Claire reading to Ethan inside, the faint sound of the boys' laughter carrying through the open windows. Margaret reached down, running her hand over Bella's head. "You've done more for this street than you'll ever know," she whispered. Bella looked up at her with those deep, knowing eyes, and for a moment, Margaret could almost believe she understood every word. Bella didn't just save Ethan's life. She reminded all of them, neighbors, friends, and strangers alike, that love, in its purest form, always stands guard. Some things can't be explained, but they still make us believe. What did this story make you think? Let us know in the comments below. Like, share, and subscribe for more. Until next time, keep your heart open to the unexpected.